Thanks.
Good afternoon and welcome to this e-Memoir session. We're looking at an update on 16 to 19 funding for 2017 to 2018. Session is going to be led by Beachcatch Marchik. We like to keep these webinars as interactive as possible, so feel free to use a question or chat facility at any time during the session. I'm going to hand over to Beach now and mute myself. Keep the questions coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good afternoon to everyone. And to those that we haven't had contact with since the new year, Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to those of you that might have it later in this month. What I'm going to do in the next 50 or so minutes is give you a brief update on what we know already about 16 to 19 funding for the next academic year. This is very much in the light of different forms of communication that we've had by the funding agency and the department with obviously providers before and since Christmas. Also, thanks very much for those of you that responded to some of the questions we put before the webinar, just to get some sense of the things that are affecting you most. And I'm going to hopefully look at some of those things with you in this webinar. Just to start off with, if you want the headlines for the next academic year, I think we've already been, we were told very much when it came to the spending review a couple of years back that we would be certainly facing a period where the funding rates for full-time 16-17 and full-time 18-year-olds, as well as the part-time rates, would, wherever possible, be maintained right up until the end of this Parliament, so 2020. And it's been confirmed that those current funding rates that apply, the ones that apply in 16-17, will be maintained into next year. This obviously will help with your planning, and it will give you certainty in this very uncertain world that you're going through in terms of all kinds of changes, not only in terms of what's happening in the curriculum, but also what's happening with things like area reviews and mergers. And I think that's one of the first questions that I would pose to you is, in the light of maintaining those current funding rates, and they have been maintained and will be maintained up to 2020, it does raise some significant issues. First of all, there's no inflation proofing in those rates, so as your costs are going up, real terms, those rates are going down. And compared to certainly the funding for 11 to 16-year-olds, there are significant issues about whether this is enough, certainly to deliver the types of programs, study programs, and the outcomes from the study programs that certainly are needed for things like economic growth and well-being. Family protection funding you knew was going to be phased out by 2020-21. In fact, this is the only area, other than in some administrative budgets, that's going to be significant savings will be made between now and 2020. So I'll come back to that. Good news, although for the majority of us this has not been an issue, but nevertheless I want to come back to it, is that the English and Maths condition of funding tolerance level that was set for this current year will actually be continued into next year. Clearly it's going to be based on a year later data in terms of the actual compliance with that condition, but I want to look at that with you as well. We've also been told that the free school meals rate will be maintained at £2.41, and again that's got implications for particularly discretionary bursary funding. But one significant change, although this has already been in place for school sixth forms and for sixth form colleges, is that for the academic year 2017-18, any learner who's 19 years old or more who continues a program that they've started when they were obviously 16 to 18 will in future be funded by the EFA and not by the Skills Funding Agency. And this brings us people in colleges and other providers in line with the practice that goes on in schools and sixth form colleges. One subtle change to disadvantaged Block 2 funding, which you know is based on prior attainment English and Maths, I'll come to, is that it's no longer going to be using what we call the young person's matched administrative data. It'll be moving over to much more emphasis and much more reliance on data that you provide through the ILR or through the school census data. One little point to note in the letter to the providers is that following the RO6 window, the return that you'll do relating to your data up till February, there will be some opportunities for those of you who wish to make business cases to get more funding for traineeships that will be available for the current year. Of impact on all of us, whether we be in schools, colleges, training providers, whatever, is, and I think also in local authorities, is that the second phase of the consultation on the new national funding formula for allocations of high needs funding to local authorities, not from local authorities obviously to providers, is going to start and started before Christmas and will continue until March. So that's some of the headlines. What I intend to do is look at them in a little bit more detail. What hasn't changed is the actual nature of the funding formula, you'll be familiar with, driven by the key if you want, the key indicators of performance, student numbers, the national rate which I've talked about, the retention factor which hopefully you've managed to maintain or increase in some cases, program cost weightings, and obviously that produces a product in terms of the average value of your students, whether it be full-time and part-time. Onto that, we're going to look at disadvantage funding, which is added on, and also large program funding, which of course will take much more precedence as we start to remove the formula protection funding. The area cost allowances will not change in the next year, and that will give you your total program funding, onto which we will then add other elements, the condition of funding adjustment for English and Maths, the care standard funding that will not change, formula protection funding which will stay but will be reducing in the amount that's being spent each year. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at high needs student funding, although that will be the focus of another webinar tomorrow, and obviously I've already talked about changes to free school meals and discretionary bursary funding. So that's the sort of formula that applies to each institution, whether it be a large college, a sixth form, local authority provider, or a commercial provider. So the first question I was posing to you, what was happening to your student numbers? Well, as you know, the funding formula in our sector, in the post-16 sector, is primarily driven by lag numbers. So your allocation in 17-18 will be based on the numbers enrolled in 16-17, and obviously that takes account of the first census point for you in terms of the school census data, and the ILR that relates to how many of your learners, were with you in November. Now there are some exceptions to that, because although it is a lag number effect, so obviously if your numbers went up in the September-October period, you'd expect to see more funding next year. Vice versa, if your numbers went down, and I think some of you have already told us that you're expecting some small falls in the funding for next year. The only exceptions to that are if you're putting on new 16-19 provision previously where there wasn't any, or if you're closing some 16-19 provision, or if there are transfers between institutions, for example, that might occur through mergers, or if, for example, there are changes to subcontracting. So there are some exceptions, but for most of us, it's the lag number effect. So just to sort of get a straw poll from those of you that can answer, are able to answer, how many of you are expecting to see, therefore, your funding to go up next year because of the lag number effect, and that's as a result of your numbers being higher this year and therefore more funding next year? So a quick straw, a show of hands. We've got a fair number of you saying yes, you expect to see funding going up. Others, obviously, it's either staying the same or going down. And obviously, that has significant implications for the availability of resources, particularly the delivery of your study programs. And of course, that can often, because of the lag number effect, mean that one year your numbers have gone up, the following year your money will be higher, but in that following year, you've actually got fewer students. And obviously, that means that you've got more resources available than perhaps students, and vice versa in other years. The full-time learners will still be classified in the same way, 540 hours and more if they're doing if they're 16 and 17-year-olds, and 450 plus hours if they're 18-year-olds. The average number of hours is still expected, particularly for your 16, 17-year-olds, to be around 600 hours, and obviously that's a mix of the qualification activity as well as tutorials, work experience, etc. We're going to continue to fund part-time learners in 4 bands, again based on the planned teaching hours. Remember, it's based on planned hours of activity. Those activities will include qualification activity and non-qualification activity. There's not going to be any change in terms of the minimum period that a learner has to be enrolled with you and attending with you to qualify for funding, and that's still 42 days, or obviously 14 days if it's a much shorter program. But just a point to note that perhaps maybe haven't picked up, we've noticed that some providers are doing quite condensed programs where you're doing maybe 450 or even 540 hours in quite short periods of time. Any program that is over 450 planned hours, even if it's less than 24 weeks, you'll still require a minimum of 42 days or 6 weeks for that learner to qualify for funding purposes. In other words, if the learner leaves before day 42, then you will not actually, that student will not be coming and will not count on your ILR data for future purposes in terms of the lag number effect. There will be no funding attached to that learner. What you already know is there's no funding attached for programs of less than 2 weeks, and obviously bear that in mind. But I think one, as I said already, one change for next year is that 19-plus-year-old students who are continuing in programs that they began when they were 16 and 17 years old, will be funded by the EFA, and that obviously is critical for those of us who are college providers or training providers, brings us in line. And obviously that transfer of fund between the SFA and the EFA will be affected, and then that will be reflected in the allocations to you. So I think a couple of points come out from that, and thanks very much for the sort of questions you've posed on that. One of the issues, of course, it raises here is what's going to happen when there's significant mergers and, you know, the transfer of students from one campus to another or one part of the organisation to another. That obviously will be taken account in any of the lag number calculations. In terms of the national funding rate, as I said, that was confirmed at the same level, and I know one of you already posed the question, you know, how does this compare, for example, to what's happening in schools? And I already mentioned it, generally in 11 to 16 funding levels are higher. Of course, that's not the case in every single part of the country because there isn't a national funding formula yet for 11 to 16. There might be. But I think what is interesting in a recent publication was actually saying that that compared to other countries was actually lower than other countries. So our average level of funding for a lot of learners at 16 to 19, it does not compare well with other countries. So just a point to note there. All full-time, that's bands 18-year-olds will continue to be treated as band 4 for the allocation, so they're going to be funded at 3,300. That's exactly the same as we've had in place for the last year. But one point to note, and some providers have fallen foul of this, is make sure that your 16 and 17-year-olds are always at 540 plus hours planned over the course of the year with a reasonable chance of that actually being delivered. So there's obviously some audit checks in there to ensure that you're going to be funded at band 5 and therefore at £4,000. The exceptions to this, of course, are all students aged 19 up to 24 who have education healthcare plans will be funded obviously at the full rate. And I think that's critical that you remember that. Obviously learning difficulty assessments will not be applied in 17-18 because they haven't been applied actually since September in this academic year. Now the basis for your distribution of obviously students between those different funding bands is based on obviously your out-term data for 15, 16, the R14 data, or obviously the out-term data in the autumn census if you're in schools. So obviously that's you can see the criticality of that lagged effect. The bands, therefore, for 17-18 are exactly the same as they were for 16-17. There's no change on that. I just wanted to note, though, and one question I was posing before the webinar, have any of you noticed any marked differences in the proportion of the students in each band? The reason I say that is that we've got evidence now that almost, if not just over 90% of all eligible learners funded through the EFA are actually on programs that would be considered to be full-time. That's 450 plus. And in many cases, of course, in most cases, they're over 540 hours. So just as another question to you to ponder, how many of you have noted that there's been a significant or marked change in the distribution? In other words, the proportion of students that you're now taking on who are less than full-time has gone down, and the proportion that are full-time and over has gone up. In other words, 450 plus hours. Because I think that's again reflective of the nature of what's happening with the 16 to 19 market, the availability of study programs, and of course the quality of those has been, of course, varied, and of course the concept and the understanding of the raising of the participation age and its extension to more learners. The part-time bands will continue to apply, and that's obviously critical for those learners in terms of meeting the English and Maths condition. And of course a lot more of those learners are now doing traineeships or shorter programs which are more appropriate for those learners who want to progress into apprenticeships or the world of work. So those the same bands will apply, as I said, in the current year. Now, in terms of the retention factor, there's no difference in the way in which that's going to be applied, but obviously it's going to be based on more up-to-date data. This will be based on your R14 data for 15-16. It applies, I just want to remind you, at the learner level, not qualification level. So although you're still measuring retention, and of course you're looking at achievement rates at individual qualification level for quality purposes, inspection, etc. For funding purposes, it means that we're looking at the whole of the learner's experience. So retention means still studying the core learning aim, if that's a vocational, professional or technical qualification, and if they're on an academic offer, then it means being retained on at least one of their A-levels or GCSEs. As I said, the performance tables will still need to reflect performance at qualification level. I think you will be aware that non-retention after day 42 without achievement, obviously if the learner does achieve the core learning aim, then there are no implications for your retention and therefore your retention funding. But any learner who is not retained after day 42 without achievement will actually, through the lag number effect, mean that the funding for that learner would be reduced to only 50% of whatever the value of that learner was, full-time or in a band. And I think to understand, therefore, that the retention factor, which applies to the totality of your learners, broken down by obviously by the different distributions between the different funding values, is in effect halfway between the retention rate and 100%. So if your retention factor, if your retention rate is 96%, your retention factor will be 98%, because the 4% of students who have not been retained would still have earned half the funding. So you can see that, and that's just highlighted in that particular table that you can see in front of you. So I think it's important to note, though, that once you've got evidence that the learner has achieved the core learning aim, for example, that also relates to traineeships, then you will have in effect earned 100% of the funding for that learner. Unlike adults, and you can see the significant difference here is, unlike adults, there is no achievement factor built into the funding formula for young people, and that clearly is a distinction that has got impacts and ramifications. The other point to note is that program cost weightings, there will be no changes this year. So again, that applies to the whole of the learner's program. So if the predominant learning aim on a 16 to 19-year-olds program is engineering, then all elements of that learner's program will be weighted at engineering. So it's based on what we call substantial learning aims. For those that maybe are new, please note that all GCSEs and A-levels are weighted at A. Now that data has also been updated for your outturn data for 15-16. So if there's been a significant shift, for example, say the number of students on A-levels has diminished, but the number of students on, say, engineering and construction has gone up, that would be reflected in your new average program cost weighting across the institution. So that's what tends to change the program cost weightings. Again, just to note that previously we had a 1.6 which applied to specialist institutions. That in the current year, that 16-17, was increased to 1.75 to reflect some of those very high additional costs associated with being a land-based or agricultural college or provider. So again, you can see the A-levels and the GCSEs and business studies, etc., weighted at A. A lot of programs that we do, hairdressing, beauty, catering, weighted at 1.2, and obviously 1.3 for things like land-based and some construction programs in general providers. So no significant changes there, and no changes to area cost allowances, which obviously reflect the higher cost with being a provider based in London and South East. And again, that varies between 2 and 20%. And as you can see from the chart and the original diagram, that applies to the whole of the programme funding, including disadvantage, which we're going to look at just now. So as you can see, lag number effect critical, the retention factor obviously quite significant. And for example, if any of your providers have noted an improvement in the retention rate on the core learning aim, then that obviously is now reflecting in the amount of funding that you're retaining rather than losing through the retention factor. And all these, when you multiply them by 2, 3 or 4,000 learners, have got significant impacts on the resource that you're going to have available next year. And I want to look at the factors that start to take, if you want, either add to the product model that we've just shown or actually reduce that. And I know that a lot of you are focusing on the English and Maths condition. You know what the condition is. It's applied since 1415. It obviously means that any learner who's in those age groups on a program of more than 150 hours, 150 hours or more, remember, so anything less than 150 hours is not covered by the condition, who don't have a grade A start to C or equivalent, or of course from 17-18 who don't hold a grade 4 to 9 on the new GCSEs, will be expected to study these subjects as part of the study program in each academic year, or up to that point where they actually attain that level of qualification. One point I think to note, although the condition has been applied with some tolerance, I think it's still very important that, for example, for 15-16 students who affect the tolerance for 17-18, for 16-17 you are just as assiduous in making sure that those learners are following those programs. And that doesn't mean just that they're enrolled, but also that they are attending. And that's why I keep on coming back to the criticality for your funding performance of retention, but also of attendance. Any student who doesn't study one of the approved qualifications will be removed from the lag number effects in future years, and obviously that's through the condition and the adjustment, which I'll look at in a minute. The additional condition that was introduced 2 years ago actually relates to those learners who are required to continue studying a GCSE rather than, say, a stepping stone qualification because they got a grade D. Please note, by the way, that does not apply to traineeships, since for these purposes they're considered to be a part-time student. So remember, the condition here applies to those students who are on programs of at least 450 hours if they're aged 18, or at least on a full-time program if they're aged 16 and 17. So obviously a learner that doesn't have either English and Maths will be expected to enroll in those subjects, subject obviously to the normal conditions in terms of what counts as a start on those programs. Remember, the changes which will be introduced with the new graded GCSEs is critical. The list of qualifications which is approved, which actually is subject to some revision. So what I'm doing is just putting up what was made known to us before Christmas. It includes obviously approved GCSEs that are obviously the new offer. You know that you'll be able to offer all GCSEs only up until this offer, that's in 2017 June, but after summer, basically after August the 1st, they will not be eligible. That also applies, by the way, to IGCSEs, which is the third point down. So we're looking at new GCSEs gradually and certainly being significant in the impact they're going to have. Functional skills up until the point where they're going to be changed, as well as freestanding maths units. ESOL, again, as long as it's recognised and accredited by Ofqual, and of course a range of entry level and level 1 QCF qualifications that have been nominated by providers that meet predefined criteria. That's those criteria that's laid down by Ofqual. I know that some of you are doing Princess Trust. Again, the full Princess Trust team program meets those, as well as a whole range of level 3 qualifications. So I think, again, for those of you that are familiar with this, keeping up to date with the eligibility is critical. Those of you new, have a good look at this, in particular in the information that your MI manager might be able to provide to you if you're a curriculum manager. The only thing to go back to is a little bit of clarification here. Remember, I did say it's that not only has the learner got to be enrolled in an approved qualification, because you might decide when to enter them for the exam, so there's some flexibility. Some learners might be on a GCSE maybe for 2 years, if that's what you want to do, but it is important that they are timetabled to attend lessons or an appropriate blend in learning. And certainly we're finding that that features quite often in inspection reports, which have been not particularly positive about study programs, is that how poor that attendance can be, and it's certainly not being promoted. So I see that if that's becoming not just a condition of funding, but more an issue about whether you should be funded in the first place, particularly if you're not a good provider. I mean, if that means that you become inadequate, then obviously it does raise some insignificant issues about future work with you. So please make sure that attendance is monitored and promoted as much as possible. And also that you meet the qualifying period. So if a learner starts on a functional skill, passes it, you can then re-enroll them on an English GCSE or Maths GCSE qualification, but make sure that that allows at least the 6 weeks for them to count towards that enrolment being counted towards the condition. And I think also to note that there's a bit of flexibility, which we talked about. The condition does not apply to programs of less than 150 hours. However, the expectation is that learners will still continue to study some English and Maths, not necessarily off that list. And obviously that also applies to small part-time programs such as traineeships, Job Centre Plus, supported internships, which again might be less than 150 hours. And so that flexibility and that sort of, if you want, degree of flexibility is built in. I was going to just remind you about the condition of funding. It wasn't confirmed until just before Christmas. We can now confirm it. So for the 2015 to 16 academic, that's the baseline for the data. Funding reductions for non-compliance with 16 to 19 and the 16 to 19 English and Maths conditions will apply only to those institutions where more than 5% of students by value, so obviously the full-time students will carry a higher weighting than large numbers of students on smaller programs, who wouldn't have had A star to C, who haven't enrolled on an approved qualification, will be removed from the ILR, and obviously then from the lag number effect. But remember, the tolerance there is more than 5%. So these students will then be removed, but they will be used not at 100% of the funding rate, but obviously 50% of the rate. And obviously that will then apply to your 17-18 allocations. Remember, for the current year, 16 to 17 allocation, it was the 14 to 15 data that we were using. So obviously this is data that already relates maybe to those students that have left. So again, I would watch out for making sure that you don't relax the requirements in terms of an assiduous approach to this in terms of studying English and Maths, particularly if they don't meet the requirements. And of course that also increasingly will apply to those new learners that will be coming in who don't have at least a grade 4 to 9 on the new GCSEs, and that will apply certainly much more 18-19 and 19-20. So are there any points or any questions at this point in terms of the update? As I said, I've covered those sort of major changes for you. Any other questions or comments? Just looking at the questions, I think we've covered most of them. Yep. Yeah, one of you is asking if I just go back in the slides to just go over that last slide again on the condition of funding. Yeah, and this is directly from the letter that was sent out to you. So it's the application of tolerance to 2017-18 academic year allocations. Remember, the key thing here is that to be within the 5%, it applies not to your existing students, not to your 16-17 students. It's actually based on what you did in 15-16. So there is that, what I'd call lagged effect there. And please be aware of it, that that might be that for 14-15 you might have been very good or not applied it, you know, whatever. Things could change quite significantly in 15-16. So I'd imagine that anyone in 14-15 that was in difficulties here, where more than 5% of the students by value had not complied with the condition, you would have lost funding in the current year. You might have put that right in 15-16, and therefore you won't be losing that funding in 17-18. So hopefully that answers the question. I think the only other point, and I know one or two of the people listening in, you've had formula protection funding applied to you certainly since we changed to the new funding formula, and that's predominantly because the £4,000 was well below the average level of funding before weightings for those students that were with you at the time that we changed this new formula. Well, this is the only area of significant savings, because each year they'll be applied a trajectory, and it will be exactly the same trajectory as applied in the current year, which will bring you down to that level of funding, which is the same as everyone else. So obviously that's been critical for some providers, particularly where they had students on larger programs. However, that's then taking account of the large program uplift, which has been applied certainly from this year and will apply again next year, and I'll come back to that in a second. One of you asked the question about free meals allocation. What is it based on? It's the proportion of students entitled to and receiving free meals, and obviously the entitlements are based on those means tested criteria, that you reported in your outturn data, R14 data, for 15-16, or the autumn census data if you're in the school. Now remember, in 16-17 in the current year, discretionary funding was reduced by £15 million. The indications are that for 17-18, the only savings that the DFE is intended to make is through formula protection funding, so there might not be for 17-18 any compensatory reduction in a discretionary bursary funding as there was in the current year. So we just watch out for that one to see if that's being confirmed or not. It's not clear in that letter, but certainly in the guidance that will come out in the new year you'll see it. Now, I know one of you has asked about the large program uplift. It won't apply to a lot of us, but nevertheless be aware this is the funding that's going to be available in 17-18. It was available obviously this year as well. For those students who take on very large programs, 4 or 5 A levels. However, be aware it reflects not the size of the program in terms of their planned hours. It reflects more that they've achieved those larger programs. There's a 10% uplift if we've got people getting 4 A levels, at least at grade B, and 5 A levels will give you 20%. There's also similar 10s and 20s being applied to IB programs, as well as other type of programs such as the technical baccalaureate or anything which is the equivalent. Now, one point to note is that this data for 17-18 is not based on your performance in the last year or the year before. It's actually still based on a 3-year lag. It'll be based on the 14-15 young persons matched administrative data for your institution. So there is a significant lag. This is not a 2-year lag, it's a 3-year lag that reflects the performance of those learners on programs in 14-15 as collected through the awarding bodies. So there is a significant lag here. As one of you have said, things might have changed quite significantly in that period, yes, but that's the basis that we're going to have for 17-18. And there's that summed up in tabular form. Now, one other area that there's been some significant change, and that was in particular in Block 2. As you know, disadvantaged funding is added on to the product of the number of learners times the funding rate times the retention factor, but we add on disadvantaged funding made up of Block 1 and Block 2. Block 1 will continue to be based on the index of multiple deprivation for 15, and that's obviously going to use the most up-to-date data, which again is R14 data for 15-16, not obviously for 14-15 as it applied in the current year. But what has changed is Block 2 funding. Block 2 funding, which is the prior attainment funding, which gives you a flat rate for each GCSE that a student has not attained at A star to C, and by the way in future that will be applied to not attained for a new GCSE at grade 4 to 9, and obviously it applies to your full-time students but also to your part-time students pro rata. Now that is traditionally used, the young persons matched administrative data, and it was therefore subject to a 3-year lag. Now, because the quality of data that's being collected through the ILR about prior attainment, what learners come in with when they come into your institution or transfer to your institution, is much more reliable, much more robust, Block 2 prior attainment funding for next year will not be using the match data. It will use the ILR or school census data, again, your 2015-16 data. So this moves it in line with other factors that are in the funding formula, such as retention factor, the distribution between the different funding bands, and it will be using the 15-16 data as well. So that's a thing to note. That's being brought up to date, and that obviously is much more reflective of a situation that's closer to reality rather than 3 years out of date. So you can see the rates as they apply to each one of the bands. So obviously some of your learners will be attracting a £960 bonus or a Block 2 payment because they've not achieved either English or maths at the appropriate grades. And obviously that's also reflected in the part-time rates. So again, if there's any significant changes there, and I would like to think that the disadvantaged funding in Block 2, which together with Block 1 is called, it is called your disadvantaged funding, one based on prior attainment, the other one based on postal codes, does raise a more fundamental question. I'll come back to it, and that is, how is that used in your institution? Because I think our experience now over the last 3 or 4 years shows that you get an allocation coming into your organization. There is a lot of freedom and flexibility as to how that allocation is used for young people on study programs and traineeships. There's no ring fencing of some of these allocations, and one of the questions that keeps on coming up is, well, how are we using that disadvantaged funding, particularly Block 2? Is it being used, for example, to support English and Maths? Because it's not being used to deliver English and Maths. English and Maths is delivered within the £4,000 or the 3,300 or whatever the pro rata part-time rate is for a study program, because that's an element in the study program. So what we're assuming here, this is being used to provide learning support, maybe for literacy, maybe for numeracy, but also it could be used and should be used for other forms of learning support, which means it's covering what used to be called additional learning support that is below the threshold that makes the student a high needs student, in other words, £6,000. So I think one of the key questions here is, although these are not ring-fenced budgets, and they're not ring-fenced in terms of the allocation, how an organisation decides to use that funding, I think, is critical. It will be reflective of your mission and of the types of learners that you're recruiting. So it's just something to just be aware of, because I know that there are some concerns, certainly from learning support managers, that they're not seeing their budgets reflect that. In some cases, the budgets are being reduced, even though the amount of disadvantaged funding is being stabilised or in some cases increasing. So just something to be aware of. In terms of the funding for high needs students, there are not going to be any significant changes in 17-18. So the funding for high needs students, that's those students for whom you've got a contract with a local authority or local authorities who are eligible to be funded, first of all, through Element 1, core funding for the programme, £4,000 or 3,300 if they're 18, but if they've got an education healthcare plan, they will still be funded at the full rate. There's the Element 2 of additional support funding, which is obviously coming to you in your allocation from the Education Funding Agency, not through the local authority, and that's the first £6,000, which is used to cover the first £6,000 of the high need students' additional learning support costs. And of course, Element 3, which is the top-up funding, which doesn't come to you in your allocation. And of course, that's totally down to the negotiation that you've got with a local authority about a named student, about any costs which that learner has, which the local authority will top up in addition to the first £6,000 that's already being paid to you for the number of places that you've got rather than the individual learners. So as we said, this places plus top-up methodology will continue to apply for 17-18. Now I know some of you are aware that there is a consultation on the future funding of high needs, and I'll come back to that at the end of the webinar, but I think that's quite a distinct process that's going on. So place-led funding will be the core funding of £4,000 for the learner. The Element 2 is the £6,000 that you get to reflect the number of places that you had. And again, this is based on data that you've collected through the ILR. This gives you financial stability and obviously it's based on the number of places. It doesn't mean that a name is allocated to each place. For top-up funding, which you'll get after getting a contract from a local authority, for the learner that's got high needs based on some agreed costing model, then obviously that means that that learner's additional funding will come to you. Remember, you cannot claim funding, high needs funding for a learner unless you've got a local authority contract. For most of your 16 to 19, I'm assuming that they'll have either a special education needs plan of some sort or an education health care plan. It's not always mandatory, because if they're high needs and they're 16 to 18, they're always, that funding is always there. But obviously for anyone who's 19 up to the age of 25, 24 when they start the program, they must have an education health care plan to be counted towards your high needs numbers, and obviously to draw down high needs funding. So just a point there. No significant changes. However, what this starts to raise, I think, are some important questions. And as I said, you know, if you're looking at the issues around high needs, for example, just going back to high needs, how many of you have seen a significant change in the number of high needs learners? So if you just get a question there, if you can just put up your hand if you've seen an increase in the number of high needs learners, just in case you've seen any increases. Yeah, one or two of you saying that, yeah? Marek, are you getting some other show of hands there? I think we're getting a few.
Actually, we're getting we're getting quite a few actually. So got some good numbers there.
And I think that's again showing that, and it's putting pressure clearly on you, because again there's a lag number effect here. Sometimes the number of places has gone up, and yet, you know, the funding is there, but the number of students isn't there in the following year. Vice versa, some years you've had a small fall in the number of students, therefore the following year the number of places has gone down, but as reality kicks in, you suddenly realize that, yeah, the amount of funding has gone down, say in 17-18 because we had a fall in 15-16, but then actually the number of people that turns up is higher than you expected. So there's always that mismatch that creates problems. The other issue, of course, is how good is your relationship with local authorities in terms of getting the top-up funding to those individual learners, certainly in time, and certainly to the extent that you need to be able to cover the total cost of that learner's program. So it's not just the cost of the study program, it's the cost of the support around that program as well. So they can see quite significant numbers there. Okay, so what sort of messages does this sort of give us? When you look at 17-18, as I said, I've looked at the sort of major changes, and as I said, that, you know, there's not a lot of change, although please be aware that there are some opportunities to get some additional funding if you can make a good business case in after RO6 for traineeship. So if you've certainly got, after February, some evidence that you're going to if you've got evidence now that you could take on more trainees in the current year above your allocation, then clearly if you can make that business case after RO6 is closed, there will be a form that you can get off the website to do it. Please do so. I think it's important the number of trainees goes up. So a study program should have all of these key elements: a substantial vocational or technical qualification, or clearly A-levels or GCSEs, English and Maths if the learner's not met the condition, and of course non-qualification and other types of qualification activities such as additional qualifications, work experience, tutorial, enrichment, and enterprise activities. As you know, you're required to show in the program plan how many hours that each individual student will be doing on qualifications and also on non-qualifications. What I think is critical is that as we're looking at study programs and the funding for study programs, it's becoming more and more apparent that I think the funding is not enough or sufficient enough to do what we're expecting to see from study programs. That is significant improvements in achievement and of course progression, not only into apprenticeships but into the world of work and into higher education. And I think therefore a more fundamental question is, although the funding formula stays unchanged, the actual quantum itself has actually been falling because the number of learners in that age group, 16 to age group has been following. So because of the demography, the only reason it's going to go up in future is because that there will be an upturn in the number of 16 to 18. But in terms of inflation proofing, in terms of the real cost of study programs, in terms of the types of learners that we're increasingly taking on and recruiting through raising of the participation age, I'm not sure if the £4,000 is enough. And I certainly would want to make a stronger case for us getting a much more equitable allocation of resource, certainly compared to the funding formula for 11 to 16 and other types of education experience. And I think that's starting to raise issues, particularly if you're looking at the performance of sixth form colleges, which has been compared with other countries, and it's not as performing as well. I think it does really well for the amount its money it's got, is I think a critical issue. So it's a more fundamental set of questions. So just to give you two examples of how these programs would be funded for next year, the same as this year, you would have a study program made up of, in this case you can see it's a 16 or 17-year-old generating at least £4,000. There are the program of just over 600 hours made up of a core learning aim, the vocational qualification. The non-qualification experience is the tutorial, the work preparation of their work experience, and in this case you can see the learners doing two functional skills. We'd assume therefore that they had not got a grade D in GCSE. They would be perhaps having done a different or equivalent qualification and certainly not achieved at a grade D at least. So that student would be generating £4,000. If the vocational program was predominantly engineering, that average weighting would be applied to the whole of that £4,000. And of course, the more of those students you have in the institution, the higher the level of the weighted funding. One of you's asked me to give an example of a traineeship. Here's one that we're running. It's 392 planned hours. Obviously, it goes into the pro rata band. Irrespective of the amount of qualifications. In this case, this learner is doing 3 qualifications. It's possible actually for them to have no qualifications if the predominant purpose is the work placement and progression into, say, apprenticeship. You can see the student's got a 200-hour work placement and doing functional skills. It's very difficult to fit in GCSEs, I think. These functional skills could be at whatever level is appropriate to the learner in terms of the start point and the progression, as well as the level 1 award. So again, both of these are examples of how study programs are funded using the funding formula. What would apply to that, obviously, and by the way, all traineeships are weighted at 1. We'd apply, obviously, a retention factor, which would be based on the whole institution's average, weighted by the size of students, and then obviously add on to each one of these students. In each case, you could add on funding that reflects their postal code, and you can also add on funding that reflects prior attainment in English and maths. But again, this is always historical because of the lag as it applies, so it's not always reflective of your current learners. And the other thing to note is, from the point of view of audit, just a question that was again, just want to remind you that looking at the audit of study programs and of the planned hours that you've allocated to a 16 to 19 student is that those hours must be relevant to the study program. In other words, what's the progression? Is it academic? Is it vocational? Is it a mix? They're going to be planned in timetable, and attendance should be monitored for purposes of quality. But also, I think, you're putting retention at risk. They're going to be supervised by you or organised by you and within your normal working pattern, and that obviously has to take account of the patterns that are reflective of things like work experience, etc., as well as being quality assured and incurring some kind of cost. Two questions have come up, one from Julie. If a trainee on a traineeship has a D for maths, what would they study? Well, since a traineeship is seen as a part-time program, there is not a requirement for them to resit the GCSE. So it might be better for you, Julie, to offer them a functional skill. And I think also, by the way, that would be more easy to fit into a traineeship, which of course could be, anywhere between 6 and 26 weeks long, particularly if you're starting it around, say, late October and finishing it sometime in early March. So I think that's quite critical. So again, it is not a requirement for them to resit. Yeah. Vicky's asked, with the changes to functional skills over the last years, do you think it's realistic to achieve a functional skill? Very good question. Generally, Vicky, I've seen the number of hours on functional skills get bigger and bigger each year. And I think that not only because of the changes, because obviously we saw what was happening in terms of achievement rates. So I'm seeing now more hours, the difference between a GCSE and a functional skill being reduced. So GCSEs were getting maybe 90 to 108 hours. I'm starting to see an increase in the number of hours to functional skills. And I think, Vicky, that reflects that very often those hours that we initially started to allocate, certainly 2 or 3 years back, to functional skills, have not actually delivered the achievements, and it's not been fair to the students. And why should, we treat one group of students different in terms of their access to good quality English and maths in terms of the hours? So it's a good point you've raised there. Thanks very much for that, Vicky. And thanks, Julie, for your question as well. By the way, if you want more guidance on the, I think Marek, we can always send out a webinar that we did on traineeships, which I think will help to assure those of you what are the things that you're required to do to meet the maths and English condition. I think a more significant issue is what happens if you've actually got someone on a traineeship who's already achieved functional skills at level 2, is that strictly you're still required to offer them a chance to change that into a GCSE. Although what I have tended to find is that we've tended to put that in with the planned hours to be completed after the traineeship, so maybe while they're on the apprenticeship, but that's something to be aware of. The audit of study programs in future and the 16 to 19 funding formula is not going to change. As I said, there is a lot more emphasis on, never mind the eligibility, it's the activity actually taking place. Is there proof that the activity took place? And I would certainly put a lot more emphasis on attendance, as well as obviously the English and maths condition. So I think that those sort of guidelines do not change. In other words, is the student eligible? Has the activity taken place? Have they met the funding condition? And have you got evidence, by the way, for retention purposes of the core learning aim? And obviously, is there, from the point of view of meeting the requirement for more and more learners to do work experience? What has been noted from some inspection reports recently is the poor quality of some of those work experience, and I think that's less of a funding issue, much more of a quality issue. Nevertheless, needs to be addressed. And what I just thought I'd do is I'd just put in an example of a small college and how it would be affected by the formula and any changes in the funding formula next year. So you can see that there's 1,000 learners based on previous year's participation rate. So the 17 to 18 would be based on the 15-16 outturn. And you can see the mix of full and part-time students. So the average value is 3,900. Retention rate of 92 creates a retention factor of 96%. You can see that the average program weighting is not that far above 1. So a lot of academic or low-cost vocational programs. Block 2 is the postal codes, Block 1 is the postal codes, Block 2 is prior attainment in English and Maths. That might change, of course, if there's a significant improvement in performance in schools. It's provided up in the north. Condition of funding, they met the condition of funding, so no money taken off. They've not got any students either in care or coming out of care. They've got 10 students through, again, lagged effect, 10 students who previously were high needs, so that gives them the 60,000. Transitional protection, that doesn't apply anyway, it hasn't applied in the last 2 years. Formula protection was applied in 2016-17. Why? Because they've got some large programs there for some of their A-level students, so that's gone down from the previous year. It's now only 100,000. And of course the free meals allocation and discretionary learner support would have been reduced last year where there was some double funding. This year we don't expect to see that happen because the only savings will be through the formula protection funding. And you can see that small provider is generating just over £4.5 million worth of funding in the and that was what would be allocated to it in the next year. So that's just an example. Have we got any other questions, Marek, or things that we've not covered? Because I know that we certainly looked at and included answers to many of the questions that you posed to me. Any other points or any other things you want before we sign off from?
Just sent one across to you from Jackie also. Hopefully you just pick that one up now.
Yeah, Jackie, yes, it is. Yes, you've got to record, and like anything, and it's similar to the processes with learners with individual needs, is we've got to record their eligibility for either because they are in care or on residential provision. Is you've got to be recorded in the LR field, and then there's standard amounts that are then attached to that individual learner. So again, yes, it's got to be recorded in a field. Everything, I mean, everything about characteristics of a learner must be recorded somewhere. That's, for example, one of the issues that we've got, and some of you have fallen into some difficulties with this. You've been trying to claim high needs funding where you haven't got evidence that there's a contract between you and the local authority that that learner comes from or is funded by. So I think it's important that, Jackie, that you're not making any claims unless you've got some evidence of that. Okay, any other questions that we've got? And by the way, the ILR guide and handbook obviously is one that you have to sort of keep up to date with the most recent versions. There will be obviously guidance documents to have this in much fuller detail, but I think the general feeling was that for 17-18, the less change there is in the way that the funding formula operates, the better. Okay.
Super. Any other questions? I know we've had a few, including from Paul. Thanks for that, Paul. Just again, just requesting some further webinars, looking at some of the specifics around, as you mentioned, the traineeships there as well. So we've run them previously, and we will run them again. And I can make sure you get a copy of previous ones as well, if you like.
I think that's a good point that Paul's raised, is that I know some of you are offering traineeships, and obviously the 16 to 18 traineeships are funded exactly the same way as study programs. So this funding formula that I just showed applies. Obviously 19 to 20 up to 24 traineeships are funded by the Skills Funding Agency, and that's got a different methodology, particularly in terms of the emphasis on qualifications, because inside a 16 to 18 traineeship it's actually possible to not have any qualifications at all, because the core learning aim is actually the work placement. So you could have a learner on non-accredited English and maths with some kind of work preparation going on, but the key thing there is that you've got evidence in the hours of activity that you're planning and that the learners have attended. And the other point that one of you raised about, it's okay looking at the funding for study programs, because that's what today is covered, but what more significantly is what's happening in terms of the quality of study programs. Well, we've been looking at designing and planning, designing and delivering high quality study programs, and I think certainly, Manik, we should put on some more in February and March in the light of what's happening in terms of inspection grades. I've just sampled, for example, this morning, 6 organisations that were inspected recently, late November or early December. One of the 6 was given a 2 for its study programs, but also had a 2 overall. 4 of the others, one was given a 4, by the way, for its study programs, and 4 of the others were given a 3. Now that's extremely worrying. I mean, I know it's a small sample, it's the most recent 6 I've looked at, but to have only 1 of those getting good, 4 getting requires improvement, and 1 inadequate is just simply not acceptable. So there's some issues still about how we're actually putting study programs together and the outcomes from those study programs. Now I know one of you said that that's primarily or significantly due to English and maths. But actually that's not what it's saying in these reports. I think there are still issues about study programs just not being holistic enough, not focusing enough on the core, not focusing enough on destinations, not having enough emphasis on a high quality work placement, and it's not just, and in addition it's also issues about English and maths. So it's a much more bigger picture, but I think it's worth us covering if you feel that's useful. And I think one of you just said, yeah, please send me details when you've got a date. We certainly will do that. Any other questions then?
Yep. Oh, I think we might have got another one there, if you bear with me. Hopefully I've not just made that one disappear. No, I think that appears to be it for the questions. I'll just check again. Any final questions? Have I missed anything from any of you, the participants? Oh,
Okay, Manic, do you want to close the recording down, and any questions I take now, just do outside of the recording. Is that okay?
super. No problem at all. That's smashing, that. I did get a note from somebody, from a provider there, who was letting us know that one of the provider in was expected early November and retained good as well. So
Oh, good,
that's
good.
always nice to hear. Thank you very much for that there. It's nice to see that you've recorrected your spelling of the organisation you work at as well. That all helps. No, that's super. So I'm just going to stop the recording.